Oh, normally quite a few. But it doesn't. What happens is that although the video goes out live, it's then permanently there in YouTube land, so that people can come along and watch it at another time. I mean, for example, in Australia, what time are we? If we're 7:30 here, it's 6:30 in the morning in Australia. Whereas in, for example, Wisconsin, it'll be 1:30.
Yeah, so they might watch it on YouTube or something like that.
Exactly, yes, yeah. I mean, we've already got a couple of people here already in the chat. We've got Julie and Dark Side of the Moon, which is where I am. No, actually, I'm not on the dark side of the moon. Cliff, you know exactly where I am.
Yes, you're in Galashiels.
You're not supposed to tell them that.
Which looks lovely like that behind you. It's just got all those fields and hills and mountains.
Yeah. So I suppose hi everybody. They're all joining in on the side chat there. And if we get through if there are some questions that I can pop up, then I can actually pop them on the bottom so that you can read them.
Yep.
So but I suppose first things first. I suppose I better sort of ask you to explain how is it that you have the misfortune of knowing me.
Well, Paul has been valiantly trying to teach me music for God knows how many years now. I bought my wife an accordion for Christmas a number of years ago, and in revenge, she bought me a tenor banjo. So Paul bravely took on the challenge of teaching us accordion and banjo. So after many, many years, we can in fact read music and play a bit of music, but we need an awful lot more practice.
The Christmas videos are just to die for, aren't they? They are fantastic.
And sometimes people may well do watching them.
In fact, I think it goes back further than that, because I think it was your daughter and son that first had the pleasure of my company. So
that's right. You taught them piano as well, and they continue to bash at the ivories to this day, 10, 15 years later.
Yeah, excellent. So, Cliff, well, first of all, congratulations on recently retiring. I know that was something you were talking about, looking forward to. But prior to that, you were the head consultant at the BGH.
Yeah. I've spent 35 years as an adult psychiatrist here in Scotland, and became medical director of the health service here in the Scottish borders. We're about 30 miles south of Edinburgh. So I was the medical director there for a few years, and I've been a psychiatrist for a long time. So I'm a general adult psychiatrist and not a forensic psychiatrist, I should make that clear. But interestingly, a number of years ago, I did some research on a topic that has come up in recent times again.
Well, that's right, because obviously when I mentioned that I'd watched Making a Murderer, you mentioned that you'd actually watched it over Christmas when it first came out. I was a couple of months later, because it was Emily doing her journalism through in Glasgow that mentioned it to me. And I thought nothing of it until 2 weeks later she came back and she sort of took over the remote control, as your daughters tend to do, and sort of sat me down. You're watching this on Netflix, First of all, first impressions, Cliff, on having watched the first series of Making the Murderer.
Well, I mean, obviously, it's a Netflix documentary series. None of us were physically there. None of us spoke to the individuals. But I thought it was an absolutely compelling dramatized documentary. It wasn't dramatized, I don't think that's the right word. But sure. I think I found it absolutely shocking from start to finish that this seemed to be the portrayal of quite a grotesque miscarriage of justice, to be perfectly honest. Here was a man of modest abilities, of modest background, of very humble rural origins, and his nephew, who appeared to have a lot of quite significant neurodevelopmental limitations. And they find themselves embroiled in a murder investigation. And long story short, to my eyes, it's a travesty of justice. that the case against them was flawed and pretty limited right from the start. And it's hard to escape the conclusion that they were, I don't know what the American terminology would be, but fitted up. Wouldn't be the word for it in this country. Now, that's a personal opinion. It's not a professional opinion. It's a member and hopefully reasonably well-educated member of the public watching that documentary. But absolutely disturbing the way they interviewed, particularly Brendan Dassey. I've worked in learning disabilities in the past, and I know the kind of things you should and shouldn't do when you're interviewing people with cognitive impairment and problems and who are limited in terms of their education and background. And I've worked with people with mental health problems for many, many years. And certainly their interview techniques were well out of order in every sense and shape.
Yeah, I mean, you've got that famous line when they're trying to get Brendan to say that Teresa was shot in the head, and they keep telling him, something was done to the head, Brendan. We need you to tell us. Yeah. And he says, "Oh, well, he punched her." Something else. "Oh, well, we cut her with a knife." "Oh, something else. Oh, we cut some of her hair off, And in the end, Mark Wiegert gets so impatient, he just says, "Right, I'm going to come out and ask you, who shot her in the head?"
Yeah.
"He did." "Well, why didn't you tell us that?" Because I couldn't think of it.
Yeah. And again, it's a very basic thing about interviewing that, if you're genuinely trying to find the truth or get an honest account, you don't feed people those questions. You don't lead questions. You don't give people yes or no answers, and you don't tell them the answer to the question that you're looking for. Right.
Yeah. I must admit, I mean, you know me quite well. I am at times quite naive. I actually got to the end, at least I got to the beginning of episode 10, and I'm thinking to myself, well, I know this is only 10 episodes. We're just about to enter the last episode. When is the story going to reach its natural conclusion? And it still hasn't. We still haven't.
No. Years later, these guys are still sitting in prison, their lives rotting away with incalculable consequences. That's hard for, even if you're guilty of a crime, a long stretch in prison it's no walk in the park, and particularly American prisons, I think, can be extremely difficult. But if you're innocent and you sit there rotting in prison for all that, that seems like a grotesque thing to inflict on people if they're innocent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things that Kathleen Zellner, she's basically told every client she's ever represented, apart from the very first one, which I think sets her apart from a lot of defense lawyers, is that I am never, ever going to defend anybody again who is guilty. When you compare her with some of the other defense lawyers that develop quite a bad reputation because they're just looking for loopholes. Somebody's guilty, clearly guilty, but they're going to do their best to try and get them off through various things. So she's basically thrown the kitchen sink at this with all sorts of testing. And one of them is the brain fingerprinting. And I can't remember exactly what happened. I think I mentioned to you about it. And I said, have you ever heard of this? Is it the P300 murmur?
Yes. And by strange coincidence, I had been involved in quite a lot of research on P300s back in the 1990s when I worked with a big research team led by Professor Douglas Blackwood at Edinburgh University. I was a middle-ranking doctor working my way up through the ranks, and I joined his research team. And one of the strands of that research was about trying to find physiological, i.e. physical markers that might associate with schizophrenia or with bipolar disorder. So we did quite a lot of research in looking at P300s as one of those possible physiological markers that would help us identify it. Possibly, we were looking for it as possibly an early recognition test for people who might develop schizophrenia. So we had acquired hundreds of people from big families with schizophrenia, and we compared with hundreds of people, normal people, usually psychology or medical students, and we compared the P300 test between people who had schizophrenia and people who did not. And we found that on the whole, people with schizophrenia had a significant delay in this P300 peak as tested by their brainwaves. So that was the nature of the research. It was part of a big program looking at the genetics and looking at other physiological markers, including eye tracking. But I knew about P300s from that time, and the technology has obviously developed further since then.
Yeah, and from obviously you've sent me a couple of articles about it. Basically, how does this identifying this P300 murmur test? But I'm not sure if it is that or not.
Okay, well, so let's dispose of a couple of things first of all. Number one, the term brain fingerprinting is very sort of sexy and interesting. It sounds as if it's a fantastic thing, like your thumbprint. It is not. Yeah. If you've ever actually looked at a 64-channel EEG, it's like recording an earthquake from 64 different points on the globe. It's a series of very difficult to decipher squiggles on a big, thick chart of paper. So that's a standard EEG. Quite difficult to interpret, quite old science going back to the 50s and 60s now. So the P300 is what's called an event-related potential, an evoked potential. So if you sit in a darkened room and you hear something and recognize it, 300 milliseconds later, on average, your brain gives a little blip, as if to say, oh, I recognize that. That's meaningful to me, that thing.
Yeah.
So it's a single evoked potential, and it's called P300 because it occurs about 300 milliseconds after the stimulus, the noise, the image, whatever it is. The range is anything between 250 and kind of 500 odd, and that's where we found people with schizophrenia, often at the higher up end of that range. Right. But there are other evoked potentials. There's a P50, there's a P150, there's a P200, and a P450. So this is one of several evoked potentials. So when I was doing this, I had mine recorded. You go into a completely darkened, blacked out room with a 32 lead EEG monitor over your head, 32 little recording electrodes. You have your eyes shut and it's dead silent because even the blink of your eye, the movement of your face, a muscular twitch can cause a massive signal that completely swamps the little brain wave. So the signal is often drowned out by the noise in the background. So you have to do it in quite careful research conditions. And I think that's been developed by Larry Farwell over the recent years and others in brain sciences into what they call a brain fingerprinting test, which I think is really interesting and really needs a lot more research, but has quite a convoluted story in terms of its usefulness as a marker. So that Professor Farwell makes great claims for this, which have not yet been fully justified in terms of the body of research literature and peer acceptance, etc., etc. But it is really interesting.
Yeah. So it's not. I mean, for example, the actual lie detector test. It's not that terribly accurate. Although in interviews, the police will say, this is foolproof. It's not, is it? The lie detector test going back was
absolutely. There is a long history of tests that people would love to portray as giving you the answer to what's going on in someone's head, to solve mysteries, simple yes or no, from handwriting analysis to graphology, dental teeth marks. You can go back further than that. I've got a bust there of phrenology, the bumps on your head, telling you if someone has a particular personality or character. So people would love a simple black and white way of working out what's going on in someone's heads. And I can tell you, after 35 years as a psychiatrist and 35 years of marriage, it is not possible to know exactly what's going on in someone else's head. It's a massive mystery and is likely to remain so for the foreseeable future. But to be fair to Larry Farwell and this technology that he has tried to develop, this may well be more reliable and better than the polygraph, because we know that the polygraph can be cheated. If you are a psychopath, and or if you have really good control of your physiological functionings, or if you take beta blockers, you can cheat polygraph tests. So polygraphs have fallen out of fashion. They are no longer flavour of the month in terms of evidence, in the same way that handwriting analysis and bite mark identification has gone as well. Even DNA technology has taken a long time to reach the levels of probabilities that we have today. So 20 years ago, DNA technology and forensic evidence was not anywhere near as an exact a science as it is now. And the P3 brain fingerprinting, so-called, could be an addition to those things at some points in the future. And it's very interesting that, as I saw in the second series of Making of a Murderer, Dr. Farwell himself actually did the brain fingerprinting test on Stephen Avery, and he did not appear to recognise any of the things that were put up on the screen. But it looked to me as, in terms of how it's done and in terms of how the technology is applied, I think the claims made for it by Farwell's company probably, in the past anyway, have outweighed the level of evidential support behind it. And of course, I think there's been a lot of turmoil in the brain fingerprinting world in the last few years as the people have fallen out and started suing each other. So it's quite a difficult context for the research to be carried on.
Yeah, I think for me, what's interesting is the fact that it was because Kathleen Zellner knows the case so well that she was able to give Larry Farwell the questions, the probing questions that would come up. And am I right in thinking that it's all down to, with this type of technology, it's all down to, what questions do you ask somebody?
Yeah, the whole point of this is that it needs to be done under really carefully controlled conditions. And I think probably by Farwell himself, although he's spent a lot of time teaching the research team in New Zealand how to do it properly. But the reality is you have to present something to the person you're testing that no one else would know about apart from them. And as Farwell himself pointed out in the Netflix series, Stephen Avery sat through a year of trials and appeals and all the rest. Almost everything that has been known about the murder of Teresa Hallback, and we need to remember she's at the centre of this. There's a crime to be answered for there. Almost all of those details, Stephen Avery sat through those. So finding bits of evidence that had never been presented that Stephen was completely unaware of, but that the real murderer would recognise, must have been a mountainous challenge in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on to our sort of next topic. So I don't want to keep you too long because I know that you've got a book club to review. Have you been reviewing some books, have you?
Yes, we've just done one called The Emigre, and we're on to Shug Bean's Tale next. So it usually involves quite a lot of wine and then sorting out the problems of the world afterwards, as men usually do.
Yes. So I suppose what I really wanted to ask you about was something that I touched on quite a long time ago. And I said, look, if and when Steve and Brendan are released, what would they require in terms of psychiatric help to cope with what they've been through so far?
This is a really serious issue. You'll be able to tell me, Paul, exactly how long those two guys have been in jail by now. I think most people, again, we didn't sit through the trial, etc., but looking at all the stuff that's been portrayed, I think those guys are innocent and were convicted wrongfully. It is shocking that it's taken so long. It is still taking so long to exonerate them and go through all of that. And at some point it will come. But when they are released, that's when their real serious life difficulties are likely to suddenly fall on them like the roof caving in. The evidence is that even if you're guilty of a crime and have done your time, then release from prison, especially after long sentences, is very, very difficult. Adjustment back to normal civilian life, if you want, is a huge undertaking. And it is no surprise that about 2/3 of people released from jail end up back imprisoned within the next 3-4 years because they really struggle to adjust. In jail, you are literally institutionalized. You don't have to think. You don't have to make any decisions. You have to protect yourself and build a facade up of whatever persona you need to adopt in prison to survive. Jails are, strangely enough, full of criminals. Some of them violent, some of them quite unpleasant. And after X years of that, you've learned the ropes of how to survive in a total institution where you don't choose your meals, you don't choose what time you get up, you don't choose what time you go to bed, you don't choose what time you take exercise. You have no ability to really think or decide for yourself. So you come out and suddenly you're faced with a world that has moved on. Your friends have moved away, disappeared, died, whatever. So you have maybe little in the way of family supports either. Perhaps you've got divorced, your family have disowned you, your parents have died. Your support structures are not there. And often the prison service just says, there you are, you're turned loose. There's no aftercare, there's no support. So other organizations have to take up that role. It is extremely traumatic because people don't know what to do with themselves. And the 2 or 3 things they need are often help with drugs and alcohol, accommodation of a stable and reliable sort that they can hang on to, and then occupational activity of some sort. If you're still a fit person of working age, a job, no matter what kind of job, however mundane it is, something that will just give you a reason to get up in the morning and a structure to your day are absolutely crucial. Because if you don't, people flounder and they drown and they take up drink and drugs or their bad habits, or they're pulled back into a lifestyle which perhaps is not very healthy to them and led them into the problems in the first place. All of that is compounded by the fact that if you are innocent and you have wasted 15, 16 years of your life, whatever, in jail wrongfully, you are naturally going to be bitter, delighted that you're free again, but bitter, angry, resentful. And what do you do with those emotions? You need help to deal with those emotions and to channel them and work through them in a constructive way. And that's not easy. So psychological help and input, even if you don't develop a psychiatric disorder like post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, severe anxiety, agoraphobia, all of those things are very much possible, and you would need professional psychiatric help with those as treatable disorders. But just the psychological adjustment back to normal civilian life is a huge and very significant undertaking. Combine the bitterness of wrongful conviction and loss of X years of your life, possibly with hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of dollars of compensation. That's an incendiary mix there that can often destroy people's lives in very short order. So I hope that if and when Stephen and Brendan are released, a careful program of support to make sure that they can adjust over a period of months and months back to normal life again will be absolutely vital. They will be surrounded by sharks, parasites, charlatans, money grabbers of all sorts. And I think it would be nice if there was someone with a decent sense of decency and honor who would protect them and take care of them and make sure that their money is spent wisely and that they're able to use it to try and build something of whatever remains of their lives.
Yeah. I know it's impossible to sort of do some sort of analysis of them by proxy, from a far distance. But, given the fact that Brendan Dassey was only 16 and had the mental age of, a lot of people are saying, between a 5 and 11, I suppose the question would be, would Brendan be quite such damaged goods now as he would have been if he went in, say, at Steve's age of 22?
Hard to know. Steve's personality will have been further developed by the age of 22. I mean, our personalities continue to evolve to some extent through your life, but you have more of a sense of your adult self by the age of 22. You're beginning to kind of grow up and settle down. That goes on, well, as most people will recognize all through your life. But, Stephen will have had more of a chance to enter prison as a grown adult of average or thereabouts intelligence. Brendan, really problematic, very young, 16 with a mental age several years younger than that. Yeah. I sincerely hope he's had a really protected environment in prison, because he would be incredibly vulnerable to manipulation, abuse, physical, sexual violence of all sorts in prison. And that could, of course, to someone with that level of ability, be extremely damaging. The counterbalance to that is, of course, having been raised in a not the easiest environment before he went into prison. I mean, his mum seemed to be a very decent person, but life was not easy. Paradoxically, in prison, if he's been protected and looked after to some extent in prison as a vulnerable adult, he may have had more routine, stability and predictability than he would have had on the outside. The strange thing is that if, as one gathers, he has pretty limited neurodevelopmental abilities and a degree of Asperger's or autism, whatever you would care to call it, then structure, routine, familiarity are actually very good for people like that. They need that structure and routine. So a regimented atmosphere might not have been the worst thing to see him through his formative years. So it's very difficult to know without meeting the guy himself, but it could have been either extremely damaging or potentially reasonably stabilizing and allowing him to grow up and find his way. But of course, he will have had no contact, one would imagine, with the opposite sex, unless there are female prison warders. His social development will have been very, very limited to contact with other inmates of the penitentiary. So all of those social aspects remain to be tried out. His emotional development and his social development may have been pretty arrested in mid-teenage years. And of course, if that is the case, then when he's released and has the body of a 5-year-old man and perhaps millions in compensation, again, a pretty potentially dangerous combination for when he's released. So he'll need considerable care and attention when he comes out too.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, as you say, Brendan did benefit actually from that sort of institutionalization of his life, in that he did actually pass his high school diploma. Yep. Mm-hmm. But of course, with Steve, he's been wrongfully convicted twice. And just to sort of paraphrase a question that came up earlier, he would have been suffering from even the first wrongful conviction, but to have it happen to him twice, is there really any kind of psychological help that can be given to somebody like Stephen Avery?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is. I mean, a good skilled psychologist, particularly who has been used to helping people released from prison. There are lots of aftercare charities and voluntary societies, certainly in the UK, that will provide aftercare. It depends on what Stephen can use best. For some people, sitting down and talking it through on a weekly basis, getting the feelings off your chest, talking it through, trying to make sense of it within whatever abilities and language skills Stephen has, is one way forward. For other people, particularly if they don't like that sort of thing, then just practical activity-based things can be just as therapeutic. Sure. I've seen many patients over the years that, particularly the Scottish male, who may not be keen to wear his heart on his sleeve or to talk about feelings or emotions, many people struggle with that sort of language. But going out and running or chopping logs or pushing weights or planting trees or, cutting grass, physical activities can burn off a lot of that sort of agitation, anger, nervous tension as well. Boxing for people can actually, strangely enough, be a very good way of channeling aggression, rage, dissatisfaction, grief, all the rest. So I think it's about getting to know Stephen and tailoring whatever kind of activities or psychological therapy or help. But no, he should be helpable. The worst possible thing would be just to leave him to flounder atop a bed of money back where he came from. A plan needs to be made to help him structure and organise his life. obviously he needs to be at the centre of that and decide all of it. Some wise guidance, perhaps even from ex-cons, people that have been through the system and come out the other side, would be no bad thing. But some careful thought does need to be given to it. The last thing you would want, because people can and do commit suicide. They resort to drugs, they overdose, and they commit suicide because they just can't cope after all those years of expectation. And it would be a beyond tragic for that to happen in these circumstances.
Well, actually, you touched on something there. It was probably the worst documentary that I've ever seen on Netflix. Was the Time Khalif Browder story about a young lad that was kept on Rikers Island for 3 years, just waiting for a trial. Yep. And when he's finally released, he ends up committing suicide, even though he was set to receive, and this sort of action carried on posthumously, millions in compensation for what had happened to him. I don't think that Stephen Brendan, when they're released, the state are going to pay them straight off. I think it's going to be a case of Zellner's going to have to pursue them with some sort of civil suit. You would hope that the system would be in place that once somebody is exonerated, like they get immediately compensated. I don't think they're going to get a huge amount of money straight away. I think it's going to be a case of fighting it through the courts.
A bit of time to adjust would be good, and then money in a stream would be good. The other thing they'll have to be wary of course, is that the media will want access to them. They'll be on talk shows and chat shows, and again, the dangers of becoming a media puppet or misused by television channels and all the rest is again a danger, a risk for them. They'll want to tell the story, and why wouldn't you? But again, there are risks attached to all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to think that in that respect, because of the faith that Stephen has in Kathleen Zellner, that Kathleen Zellner could actually handle a lot of that. For him,
people often have a low opinion of lawyers, but from what I've seen about her efforts in this case, she seems like the kind of person that you can trust and you would want on your side if you were in difficulties. She genuinely seems to want justice and the truth, and that's not something you can always say about all of the legal profession.
Excellent. Well, finally, I've got one more question for you. Have you enjoyed any more nice whiskies lately?
Oh, yes. I have a bottle of Talisker in there that I got when I retired, which is a Talisker related to Game of Thrones. So it's the House Greyjoy of Talisker. And I also have got a lovely Irish whiskey called Old Middleton, which is a quite rare Irish malt whiskey, which is a lovely drop as well. So the next time I see you, Paul, I'll put you to a sip of that.
Well, for Christmas, I got myself a Mimi of the Brewick Laddie, the blue bottle. Very nice. Yes, and I think we also got some Lafroig and Old Pulteney. So
full strength, fully caffeinated whiskies.
Yes, proper stuff. Yes. Anyway, have a great time with your book club. I know it's something that's actually quite important in Melrose, isn't it? Because they have a book festival.
Yep. It's been cancelled this last year, but it's hopefully on in September this year. There's been some infection going around, I gather, so they've postponed it till September this year. So hopefully by then we'll all be free to move about again. And I look forward to catching up with you. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Andrew, thanks very much, Cliff. Catch you soon.
Thanks.
Cheers. Bye for now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye all.